They said I was unstable, that I was too emotional, too tired, too busy to be a good mother. And suddenly my parents, the same people who once ignored me, wanted custody of my daughter. They said it was for her stability. But I knew my family. They never do anything out of kindness. Something else was driving them. Something they didn't want me to find out. And when I finally discovered the truth, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I made sure their secret destroyed them instead. Before I tell you how I uncovered their plan and turned it against them, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. My name is Lauren Carter. I'm 32, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, with my 7-year-old daughter, Ella, my heartbeat, my reason, my everything. If you told me last Christmas that my own family would try to take her from me, I would have laughed. But betrayal doesn't start with war. It starts with a smile that hides a motive. It began after my Aunt Margaret's funeral. She wasn't just family. She was the only person who saw through my parents' performance, their obsession with image, their quiet cruelty dressed as discipline. She once told me, "Lauren, some people don't love you. They love what you can give them. Learn the difference early." When the will was read, everyone sat in that polished law office pretending to mourn, but I saw their eyes flick toward the papers. The lawyer read slowly, first the charities, then the family gifts. And then he said something that made my stomach twist. He didn't mention a number. He didn't even mention money. But he said my daughter's name, Ella. And suddenly, everyone's faces changed. My mother leaned forward. My father stopped breathing for a second. And my sister, Chloe, gave that practiced, slow smile that always meant one thing. She just found leverage. After that day, the phone calls started. At first, they sounded sweet. "We miss Ella. Let us babysit more often." Then came the digs. "You work so much, Lauren. She needs consistency." And then the manipulation. If you really loved her, you'd let her spend more time in a stable home. Stable. That word started haunting me. They said it every time they wanted to make me feel small. One night, Ella came home quieter than usual. When I tucked her into bed, I noticed a faint bruise on her wrist. "Sweetheart, what happened?" I asked. She hesitated, then whispered. "Grandpa grabbed me because I said I wanted to go home." My blood ran cold. She looked up at me, eyes wide. "He said if I keep saying that, a judge might take me away from you." I held her so tight she could barely breathe. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house shaking. My mom sat at the kitchen counter like nothing had happened. "Lauren," she said, "you're being dramatic again. Kid's bruise. Don't start a scene." And Chloe, she leaned back in her chair and said, "If you're this emotional all the time, maybe the court will agree you're not ready for this." That word again. Court. A few days later, an email appeared from my ex-husband, the man who'd walked out on us when Ella was 2. Subject, custody discussion. I opened it and froze. It said he'd been contacted by family members who were concerned for Ella's well-being. Attached was a forged social services report, listing me as mentally unstable and financially mismanaging inheritance assets. There it was again, that word, inheritance. Except I had no idea what inheritance they were talking about. That's when I realized this wasn't about my parenting. It wasn't about Ella's safety. It was about something else. Something that Aunt Margaret had left behind. But I didn't cry. I didn't call them or yell. I remembered what my aunt used to say whenever she caught me doubting myself. Never fight noise with noise. Fight it with proof. So, I started collecting proof. Every text, every message, every bruise, every odd word from Ella that didn't sit right. I recorded calls. I wrote dates. I took photos. And when I had enough, I drove 2 hours to meet the lawyer who'd handled my aunt's estate. He remembered me immediately. And when I told him what was happening, his expression shifted. Pity, then concern. "Lauren," he said quietly, "your aunt, she prepared for this. She left something for you. But she made me promise to give it only if your family ever tried to take your daughter." He reached into his drawer and slid a sealed envelope across the desk. I stared at it, heart pounding. "What's in it?" I asked. He met my eyes. The reason they want her. And the way to end it. I drove home gripping that envelope like my life depended on it. Because deep down, I already knew whatever was inside would explain everything. And I was right. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for hours before I opened it. It felt heavier than paper should, like it carried a weight words couldn't describe. Ella was asleep in her room, her small hand curled around her stuffed bunny, the same one Aunt Margaret gave her on her 5th birthday. For a long time, I just stared at the envelope. My aunt had known me better than anyone, which meant if she left something sealed, it wasn't just information. It was protection. When I finally tore it open, a folded letter fell out, handwritten in my aunt's familiar script. The first line made my breath catch. "Lauren, if you're reading this, it means they've started circling you and Ella." I felt the air leave my chest. She knew. Her words continued. "I've seen the way your parents look at money, the way Chloe mimics their hunger. There's something I never told them because I knew it would destroy you both if they found out. So I kept it hidden, safely. It belongs to Ella, but more importantly, it's tied to her name in ways only you can unlock. Never let them near her legally. That's what they want." There it was. Aunt Margaret hadn't just left memories. She'd left something real, something my family had already discovered, or at least suspected. But what? I searched the envelope again. Inside was a single key, small, brass, and engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize. And a note scribbled at the bottom. "You'll understand when you visit the bank." That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me flinch, every creak, every car passing outside. When I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's cold smile, my father's fake concern, Chloe's constant watching. The next morning, I drove to the address my aunt had once used on an old deposit slip I'd seen years ago. It was a small community bank downtown, the kind with wood-paneled walls and quiet tellers who remembered your name. I walked up to the counter, letter in hand. The teller scanned the key and frowned slightly, then nodded and disappeared into a back office. Minutes later, a man in a gray suit stepped out and said, "Miss Carter, this way, please." He led me into a private room, set a box on the table, and left without a word. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside were papers, old, official-looking, wrapped neatly in a band. The first document was a deed, then a trust certificate. Then I froze. The name on the papers wasn't mine. It was Ella Carter, and listed under beneficiary was my daughter, with an account established the same year she was born. The numbers didn't mean much to me at first, rows of codes, legal jargon, until I reached the last page. At the top, the words Carter Family Holding, Private Investment Portfolio, stared back at me. And the final valuation line made my stomach drop. Even though I didn't know the full figure yet, I could tell from the way the digits stretched across the page, this wasn't just inheritance. It was life-changing wealth. That's why they wanted her. That's why they were pretending to care. They didn't see Ella as a child. They saw her as access. I stuffed the papers back into the box and left the bank shaking. Outside, the Charleston sun was warm, but I couldn't feel it. All I could think about was how far they had gone, pretending to be concerned, contacting my ex, manipulating social services. They wanted legal custody so they could claim management over Ella's inheritance. When I got home, I called the lawyer who had handled the estate and asked him straight out, "Did my parents ever contact you after the will was read?" He hesitated before saying, "Yes. They asked for copies of all the financial documents. I told them those were sealed under your authority. They weren't happy. Not happy. That's one way to describe people plotting to steal your child's future." From that day, I knew I couldn't trust anyone. I pulled Ella from her weekend visits. I stopped answering my family's calls. And I changed every password, locked every account, and started documenting every single interaction like I was preparing for war. Because I was. But they didn't take no quietly. That week, I got served with official papers, custody review filings. They were accusing me of creating a toxic environment and emotionally neglecting my child. My hands shook as I read it, but something else happened too. I smiled. Because I already had proof they were lying. Every bruise, every voice recording, every message, all neatly backed up and time-stamped. They had started the war, but I was the one who had the truth. That night, I tucked Ella into bed. She looked up at me and whispered, "Mom, am I in trouble?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart, but they are." I turned off the light and went back to the kitchen, where the letter still sat open under the lamplight. At the bottom, Aunt Margaret had written one last line I hadn't noticed before, faint, like a whisper meant for later. When the truth feels too heavy to carry, remember, power only hurts the weak when you let them think you are one. And I decided right then. I wasn't weak anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at those papers, the trust documents, the seals, my daughter's name printed in black ink. I kept tracing the same sentence over and over again. All holdings to remain in beneficiaries' trust until the age of 18. 18. That was 11 years away. 11 years for my family to manipulate, control, and twist every rule to get what they wanted. By morning, I was done waiting. I called the estate lawyer again. This time, I didn't ask politely. I need to know everything, I said. Exactly what's tied to Ella's name. He paused for a long moment, then sighed. All right, Miss Carter. But you need to understand, your aunt didn't want this known widely. I'm her mother, I said, and they're trying to take her from me. So I think she'd want me to know. Another pause. Then he spoke slowly, carefully. Your aunt invested in a portfolio years ago. Properties, bonds, several companies. It's now worth roughly $35 million. $35 million. For a few seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I just sat there gripping the phone, staring at the morning light spilling across the counter, realizing that my parents weren't just being controlling, they were being strategic. They'd found out about the inheritance. And if they could win custody, they'd gain full legal control of every cent. I finally whispered, so that's what they've been doing. The sudden kindness, the fake concern, it was never about love. The lawyer sighed again. Your aunt knew how they'd react. That's why she structured it the way she did. To protect Ella until adulthood. But they'll try. They always do. When I hung up, my hands were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from clarity. Every lie, every manipulation, every little comment suddenly made sense. The bruises, the fake social services report, even my ex-husband's sudden reappearance. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to build a legal case to make me look unstable. And if they succeeded, Ella wouldn't just lose her mother, she'd lose everything her aunt left for her. By noon, my phone started buzzing again, calls from my mother, then my sister. I ignored them. Then the text came in. MOM, you're making a mistake shutting us out. CHLOE, we can work this out before things get ugly. MOM, we just want what's best for Ella. CHLOE, if you don't cooperate, this could end badly for you. I sat there, staring at the screen, realizing they weren't even hiding it anymore. This wasn't concern. It was a threat. That evening, I went to the courthouse and filed for a protective order. Not against physical harm, though I knew they were capable of it, but for harassment. I needed to establish a legal record that they were targeting me and my daughter. The clerk looked at the messages and nodded. You did the right thing, she said. Document everything. Judges don't ignore patterns. Patterns. That word stuck with me, because my family's cruelty had always followed one. When I got home, Ella was coloring quietly at the kitchen table. She looked up and smiled. Mom, can we make pancakes tomorrow? Grandma always says you burn them. I knelt beside her, brushing her hair back. Sure, sweetheart, I said softly, but Grandma's not coming around for a while, okay? Her little face fell. Did I do something wrong? I shook my head. No, honey, you didn't do anything wrong. They did. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I started a new document titled Evidence, Custody Plot. I listed every date, every interaction, every lie. Underneath, I attached voice recordings, my father's warning, Chloe's veiled threats, my mother's manipulation. Then, I uploaded scanned copies of the will, the trust, and Aunt Margaret's letter, proof that this wasn't a misunderstanding. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it yet, but I knew one thing. The day they took me to court would be the day they buried themselves. A week later, my prediction came true. A thick envelope arrived in the mail, stamped with the court seal. Inside was a petition for full custody, filed jointly by my parents and my ex-husband. They claimed I was mentally unfit to provide stable care for Ella, that I isolated her from family, that I was unstable and emotionally unpredictable. I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, it was almost pity. because they'd made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. At the hearing, I sat quietly across from them. My mother wore pearls, her hair perfectly pinned. My father pretended concern, and my ex sat smugly beside them, acting like the hero who'd stepped in for the child's best interest. When the judge asked for their supporting evidence, they handed over falsified reports, photos edited to look like my home was unkempt, and even fabricated text logs suggesting I'd left Ella unattended. Then, when it was my turn, I handed over a single USB drive and a folder. Inside, real messages, real recordings, real proof. The judge's brow furrowed as he listened to my father's voice on tape, saying, "If she keeps running her mouth, we'll just take the kid. She won't win against us." My mother's recorded call, where she said, "Just play nice for now. Once we have custody, we'll make sure the money stays where it belongs." And the email chain from my ex, admitting he was in discussions with them about the financial arrangement. The courtroom was silent. The judge's eyes moved from me to them and back again. He leaned forward slowly and said, "It seems clear who's acting in bad faith here." I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just held Ella's small hand under the table and whispered, "It's almost over." But I was wrong. Because it wasn't over yet. It was only beginning. What they didn't know was that I hadn't shown the full letter from Aunt Margaret. Not yet. There was one line I hadn't revealed to anyone, not even the lawyer. The line that would make my next move possible. "Lauren, if they ever try to take from her what's rightfully hers, you have my permission to expose everything." And I plan to do exactly that. They always imagined their strategy was safe because they were careful with appearances. They'd spent decades building an image, polite at church, generous at fundraisers, the perfect hosts at holiday dinners. Their reputation was the one thing they thought could shield them from consequences. They were wrong. After the custody hearing, the one where the judge called their petition suspect and declined to remove Ella, things accelerated. The law didn't move overnight, but legal wheels grind with a weight that becomes impossible to ignore once they're rolling. I had already started all of them, quietly. Criminal referrals, a full dossier for the district attorney, copies to the court, and a sealed packet for the estate attorney. I did it systematically, with the same patience I used to rock Ella to sleep when she was little and the same care my aunt had shown me when she left instructions in the envelope. First, the criminal referral. I uploaded everything the DA needed. The recordings of my parents plotting to take the kid, the forged social services report they'd circulated, the email chain between my ex and Chloe discussing financial arrangements, and the bank's confirmation that the trust documents named Ella and couldn't be legally diverted without court action. The prosecutor's office opened an inquiry the next week. Fraud, attempted manipulation of public records, and conspiracy were on the table. Second, the trust protection. Daniel, Aunt Margaret's lawyer, had already placed temporary blocks on any attempts to change beneficiary status or access the holdings. That sealed the financial motive, and it was a pain point my parents hadn't anticipated. With a court order in hand, even if my parents tried to rush a guardianship petition, they couldn't touch the accounts without a judge's permission. That bought us time to turn whispers into facts. But the legal route alone wouldn't silence the people who relied on gossip and community grace. So I took the quieter, more devastating path, exposure that cut the stage out from under them. I sent carefully redacted packets to 3 places: the church committee where my father sat on the board, the local PDA where Chloe volunteered, and the small neighborhood group that helped plan charity events. Everyone received the same folder, copies of the forged paperwork, the audio of my father admitting he'd take the kid to secure the money, and the estate clause that would strip them of anything Margaret had earmarked if they acted in bad faith. It was factual, unemotional, and surgical. No slander, only proof. When people you've manipulated for years actually read what you've been doing in your own voice, the fallout is swift. The pastor called a special session that week and asked my father to step down from the committee pending an investigation. Chloe was pulled from the PDA leadership role she'd coveted for years. The neighborhood volunteers who once praised their holiday spread stopped returning calls. The friends who had drunk the Kool-Aid of their generosity suddenly wanted distance. Reputation, the currency they'd valued above everything, shrank overnight. Meanwhile, the DA's office interviewed several witnesses. An audit of a social services submission revealed obvious tampering. A handwriting expert confirmed that at least one supporting statement had been altered. The county clerk discovered that the forged submission had been backdated and that an official's name had been used without consent. Those were the sharp edges that cut deepest. Fraud is teeth. It leaves marks that professionals cannot ignore. The criminal investigation led to subpoenas. My parents were asked to explain phone logs, bank transfers, and a number of late-night conversations they'd had with my ex Chloe's involvement in contacting the ex-husband, and the lawyer threads showing her coordination were the last straw. They tried to spin stories on the local neighborhood boards, claiming I had set them up, but outside the circle of those who already loved them, sympathy was thin. People don't like to be lied to, especially when children and money are involved. When the sheriff served the no-contact orders and the DA's office announced the inquiry publicly, it was a cold, humiliating moment for them. My mother stood on the porch the day a reporter called. For the first time since I was a child, she had nothing to hide behind. The local paper ran a meticulously sourced piece that stuck to facts, forged documents, the estate protections, and the open investigation. It did not yell. It simply showed the receipts. That silence, the sound of public trust sliding away, felt more effective than any screaming. Legal consequences followed. My parents were fined for falsifying official documents and required to attend court-ordered mediation and parenting education programs. Chloe lost her volunteer positions and was investigated for her communications with the ex-husband and the lawyer. The trust remained locked. Not only did they fail to gain custody, but they were now officially under scrutiny for trying to use a child's life as currency. On a practical level, some of their financial support systems began to collapse. Community donors withdrew pledges when the church asked for time to reassess leadership. A small charity had listed my father as a board member. Within days, they asked him to step down. Not because I wanted to destroy them, but because institutions must protect themselves when volunteers are accused of manipulating families for money. The ripple effect was unavoidable. Through it all, Ella was the calm center. I kept her life as normal as I could. School, art classes, sleepovers with a friend she trusted. She asked questions, small ones, the things a 7-year-old needs to understand. "Will Grandma be mad?" she asked once, fingers tangled in her blanket. "They won't be mad anymore," I told her. "Not for us. We moved, too. Nothing dramatic, just a modest apartment in a safe neighborhood, a fresh set of curtains, and a shelf for Ella's drawings. I changed jobs to something with more predictable hours and real benefits. Daniel helped with a trust protector appointment, a court-assigned trustee who ensured the trust could not be tampered with by family until Ella was of age. Aunt Margaret's foresight had been precise. She hadn't just loved Ella, she protected her legacy in a way my family's greed couldn't touch. People ask if I felt vindictive when everything collapsed for them. The truth is more complicated. I felt cold satisfaction, the same clarity you get when you finally cut a rope that's been strangling you for years. I also felt relief, enormous and pure, relief that the little girl who slept beside me every night would not be bartered away for someone else's comfort. There were moments of pain, too. My father called once from a blocked number and said, voice raw, "You've ruined everything." I listened to the old hurt in his tone, the one he'd never allowed himself to feel when he pushed me into corners as a child. But I also knew I couldn't take it back. You don't undo years of manipulation with a phone call. The consequences were their making. Months later, after legal hearings, mediations, and quiet settlements, the public and legal record stood clear. My parents had attempted an illegal scheme to gain custody for financial benefit, and the trust protections held. They lost not just the chance at guardianship, but standing in the community. Gifts they'd once wielded as proof of charm no longer mattered. They had traded a family for an illusion. At home, life reacquired small, honest joys. Ella painted a mural on her bedroom wall, a sun with long bright rays and 2 stick figures holding hands. That night, she fell asleep with her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll have a house of my own and invite you to all my pictures." I pressed my forehead to hers and felt a kind of peace I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years. So did I go too far? Some will say I was ruthless. Others will say I was precise. I say this. When someone treats your child like currency, and your family uses you as a stepping stone to get to that currency, you are allowed to protect what matters. I didn't shout. I didn't stoop to their level. I gathered the truth, let it speak, and let the legal system do the rest. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from. I'm collecting stories from all over, and I read every single one.